The boys of capital. They also chortle in their martinis about the death of socialism. The word has been banned from polite conversation, and they hope that no one will notice that every socialist experiment of any significance in the 20th century, without exception, has either been crushed, overthrown, or invaded, or corrupted, perverted, subverted, or destabilized, or otherwise had life made impossible for it by the United States. Not one socialist government or movement, from the Russian Revolution to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, from Communist China to the FMLN in El Salvador, not one was permitted to rise or fall solely on its own merits. Not one was left secure enough to drop its guard against the all-powerful enemy abroad and freely and fully relax control at home. It's as if the Wright brothers' experiments with flying machines all failed because the automobile interests sabotaged each test flight. And then the good and God-fearing folk of the world looked upon this, took notice of the consequence, nodded their collective heads wisely, and intoned solemnly, "Man shall never fly." Instances of the United States overthrowing or attempting to overthrow a foreign government since the Second World War. China, 1949 to the early 1960s. Albania, 1949 to 1953. East Germany, the 1950s. Iran, 1953. Guatemala, 1954. Costa Rica, mid-1950s. Syria, 1956 to 1957. Egypt, 1957. Indonesia, 1957 to 1958. British Guiana, 1953 to 1964. Iraq, 1963. North Vietnam, 1945 to 1973. Cambodia, 1955 to 1970. Laos, 1958, 1959, 1960. Ecuador, 1960 to 1963. The Congo, 1960. France, 1965. Brazil, 1962 to 1964. The Dominican Republic, 1963. Cuba, 1959 to the present. Bolivia, 1964. Indonesia, 1965. Ghana, 1966. Chile, 1964 to 1973. Greece, 1967. Costa Rica, 1970 to 1971. Bolivia, 1971. Australia, 1973 to 1975. Angola, 1975 and the 1980s. Zaire, 1975. Portugal, 1974 to 1976. Jamaica, 1976 to 1980. Seychelles, 1979 to 1981. Chad, 1981 and 1982. Grenada, 1983. South Yemen, 1982 to 1984. Suriname, 1982 to 1984. Fiji, 1987. Libya, 1980s. Nicaragua, 1981 to 1990. Panama, 1989. Bulgaria, 1990. Albania, 1991. Iraq, 1991. Afghanistan, the 1980s. Somalia, 1993. Yugoslavia, 1999 to 2000. Ecuador, 2000. Afghanistan, 2001. Venezuela, 2002. Iraq, 2003. Haiti, 2004. Somalia, 2007 to present. Honduras, 2009. Libya, 2011. Syria, 2012. Ukraine, 2014. Since Killing Hope was published in 1995, the U.S. has conducted at least 13 more regime change operations, several of which are still active. Those include Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, the third U.S. invasion of Haiti since World War II, Somalia, Honduras, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, Iraq, Nicaragua, and Venezuela again. Italy, 1947 to 1948. Quote, "Those who do not believe in the ideology of the United States shall not be allowed to stay in the United States, end quote, declared the American Attorney General Tom Clark in January 1948. In March, the Justice Department, over which Clark presided, determined that Italians who did not believe in the ideology of the United States would not be allowed to emigrate to or even enter the United States. This was but one tactic in a remarkable American campaign to ensure that Italians who did not believe in the ideology of the United States would not be allowed to form a government of a differing ideology in Italy in their election of 1948. 2 years earlier, the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, one of the largest in the world, and the Socialist Party, the PSI, had together garnered more votes and more seats in the Constituent Assembly election than the Christian Democrats. But the two parties of the left had run separate candidates, and thus had to be content with some ministerial posts in a coalition cabinet under a Christian Democrat premier. The results, nonetheless, put the fear of Marx into the Truman administration. For the 1948 election scheduled for April 18th, the PCI and the PSI united to form the Popular Democratic Front, the FDP, and in February won municipal elections in Pescara with a 10% increase in their vote over 1946. The Christian Democrats ran a poor second. The prospects of the left winning control of the Italian government loomed larger than ever before. It was at this point that the U.S. began to point its big economic and political guns upon the Italian people. There were several major concerns, mainly agricultural and economic reform. But it was the goal of the U.S. and the Italian propaganda, however, to make the election about democracy versus communism, the American way of life versus the Soviet way of life. A specious proposition which must have been a shock to leftists who regarded themselves as Italian and neither Russian nor American. Despite the fact that the communists were the most active anti-fascist group in Italy during the war, the Christian Democrat government of 1948, with monarchists and even fascists, flipped reality on its head. Communists were now seen as pushing for a communist dictatorship, while their adversaries had a love of freedom. For example, a group of American congressmen casually and arbitrarily concluded that, quote, "The country is under great pressure from within and without to veer to the left and adopt a totalitarian collective national organization," end quote. In February 1948, after non-communist ministers in Czechoslovakia had boycotted cabinet meetings over a dispute concerning police hiring practices, the communist government dissolved the coalition cabinet and took sole power. The Voice of America pointed to this event repeatedly as a warning to the Italian people of the fate awaiting them if Italy went communist, and as used as well by anti-communists for decades afterward as a prime example of communist duplicity. Yet by all appearances, the Italian Christian Democrat government and the American government had conspired the previous year in an even more blatant usurpation of power. When the Italian premier in January 1947 asked for aid for his war-torn and impoverished country during his visit to Washington, it can be reasonably assumed that American officials had other priorities, for when the premier returned to Italy, he dissolved his cabinet, which included several communists and socialists. The press reported that many people in Italy believed that the premier's actions was a result of his visit to the United States, a direct effort to decrease leftist influence in the Italian government. 2 weeks passed before it became clear that a center-right government was infeasible. The new cabinet still included communists and socialists, although the left had lost key positions, notably the ministries of Foreign Affairs and Finance. From this point until May, when Gasperi's deputy, Ivan Lombardo, led a mission to Washington to renew the request for aid, promised loans were, quote, frozen by the United States for reasons not very clear. On several occasions during this period, the Italian left asserted their belief that the aid was being held up pending the ouster of leftists from the cabinet. The New York Times wrote, quote, "Some observers here feel that a further leftward swing in Italy would retard aid," end quote. The De Lombardo arrived in Washington. De Gasperi again dissolved his entire cabinet and suggested that the new cabinet would manage without the benefit of leftist members. This was indeed what occurred, and over the ensuing months, exceedingly generous American financial aid flowed into Italy, in addition to the cancellation of the nation's $1 billion of debt to the United States. Quote, "It was primarily this fear," end quote, William Colby, former director of the CIA, has written, quote, "that had led to the formation of the Office of Policy Coordination, which gave the CIA the capability to undertake covert political, propaganda, and paramilitary operations in the first place," end quote. But covert operations, as far as known, played a relatively minor role in the American campaign to break the back of the Italian left. It was the very overtness of this endeavor, without any apparent embarrassment, that stamps the whole thing with such uniqueness and arrogance, one might say swagger. The fortunes of the FDP slid downhill with surprising acceleration in the face of an awesome mobilization of resources, such as just a few of the following. CIA operatives and agents worked with contacts which they had made and nurtured during the war years within the American and Italian mafias. These contacts provided links to local politicians in Italy and provided financial support through the direct distribution of funds provided by the U.S. government through the CIA. The CIA also provided funds to mafia-connected labor leaders to ensure that the communists would not be able to obtain control of the labor unions, and thus their important support in the general elections. In the United States, more than 200 labor leaders of Italian-American descent met in conference and generated letters to newspapers in Italy endorsing resistance to communist influence in the unions. The United States also had announced that Italians who endorsed the Communist Party in Italy would be forever denied entry into the United States. As they had during the war, Italian and American mafia leaders worked in tandem with U.S. intelligence agents to identify persons of influence and to provide them with the funds necessary for them to control the votes in their area. The Communist Party in Italy suffered a crushing defeat in the 1948 elections, but U.S. funding of Italian political parties, labor unions, and organized crime members continued in Italy well into the 1960s. The State Department backed up the warnings in the letters by announcing that, quote, "if the communists should win, there would be no further question of assistance from the United States," end quote. The Italian left felt compelled to regularly assure voters that this would not really happen. This, in turn, inspired American officials, including Secretary of State George Marshall, to repeat the threat. Marshall was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. A daily series of direct shortwave broadcasts to Italy, backed by the State Department, and featuring prominent Americans, the Attorney General went on the air and assured the Italian people that the election was a, quote, "choice between democracy and communism, between God and godlessness, between order and chaos," end quote. The Justice Department served notice that the Italians who joined the Communist Party would be denied that dream of so many Italians, emigration to America. The State Department then ruled that any Italians known to have voted for the Communists would not be allowed to even enter the terrestrial paradise. A department telegram to New York Politico read, quote, "voting communist appears to constitute affiliation with Communist Party within meaning of immigration law and therefore would require exclusion from the United States," end quote. It was urged that this information be emphasized in letters to Italy. The United States government stated that it favored Italian trusteeship over some of its former African colonies, such as Ethiopia and Libya, a wholly unrealistic proposal that could never come to pass in the post-war world. The Soviet Union made a similar proposal. The CIA, by its own later admission, gave $1 million to Italian center parties, a king's ransom in Italy, 1948, although another report places the figure at $10 million. The agency also forged documents and letters purported to come from the PCI, which were designed to put the party in a bad light and discredit its leaders. Anonymous books and magazines, funded by the CIA, told in vivid detail about supposed communist activities in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Pamphlets dealt with PCI candidates' sex and personal lives, as well as smearing them with the fascist and/or anti-church brush. And these were just some of the activities that were carried out by the CIA in this time period. In his historic speech of March 12, 1947, which came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, the president had proclaimed, quote, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way." End quote. The Italian-American Committee for Free Elections in Italy held a rally to denounce the propaganda blitz, declaring that, quote, "thousands of Americans of Italian origin feel deeply humiliated by the continuous flow of suggestions, advice, and pressure put on the Italians, as though they were unable to decide for themselves whom to elect." End quote. Though some Italians must have been convinced at the time that Stalin himself was the FDP's principal candidate, the actual Soviet intervention in the election hardly merited a single headline. The American press engaged in speculation that the Russians were pouring substantial sums of money into the Communist Party's coffers. However, a survey carried out by the Italian Bureau of the United Press revealed that the anti-communist parties spent 7.5 times as much as the Front Democratic Party on all forms of propaganda, the Christian Democrats alone spending 4 times as much. As for other Soviet actions, Howard K. Smith presented this observation. The Russians tried to respond with a few feeble gestures for a while. Some Italian prisoners were released, some newsprint was sent to Italy and offered to all parties for their campaign, but there was no way of resisting what amounted to a tidal wave. There is evidence that the Russians found the show getting too rough for them and actually became apprehensive of what the American and British reaction to a communist victory at the polls might be. Russia's concern about conflict with the West was also expressed within a month of the Italian elections in one of the celebrated Commonform letters to Tito, accusing the Yugoslavs of trying to involve the Soviets with the Western powers when it, quote, "should have been known that the USSR, after such a heavy war, could not start a new one," end quote. Now, the evidence Smith was alluding to was the Soviet rejection of the Trieste proposal. By its timing, reported the New York Times, quote, "the unexpected procedure caused some observers to conclude that the Russians had thrown the Italian Communist Party overboard," end quote. The party's newspaper had a difficult time dealing with the story. Washington did as well, for it undermined the fundamental premise of the Italian campaign, that the Italian Communist Party and the Soviet Union were indistinguishable as ends and means, that if you buy one, you get the other as well. The Christian Democrats stood as the clear winner with 48% of the vote. The leftist coalition had been humiliated with a totally unexpected polling of but 31%. It had been a crusade of the kind which Aneurin Bevan had ascribed to the Tories, quote, "The whole art of conservative politics in the 20th century," quote, the British Labour leader wrote, "is being deployed to enable wealth to persuade poverty to use its political freedom to keep wealth in power." Propaganda is a hell of a drug. If you enjoyed this video and want to know more about the subject matter, I highly suggest you check out the book Killing Hope, which this video is based on. If you like the video, please consider hitting the like button. If you really like the video, please consider hitting the subscribe button. If you really like the video, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/CaptainWaffles. Thank you.